Hello, Nameless. Welcome to the stream. Glad you could jump in. We'll be getting ready here, or starting in just a couple of minutes. We're actually doing this stream as a dedication for someone by request, Sinjin. It's his birthday, and he loves the Conan novels. So we're going to be reading one of the Conan short stories in honor of him today. Just cleaning up a couple of messages. Everybody having a good day today so far? It's a bit of a new time slot, so I'm not sure what to expect from people being able to actually tune in live for it. It's kind of a test. All right. Well, it's obviously bedtime, and this is obvious. Today, we're reading The People of the Black Circle by Robert Howard. The story is in honor of Sinjin. It's his birthday today, so if anybody wants to wish him happy birthday in the chat. He's a good man. He's working a difficult job for not a lot of appreciation. He goes in and makes sure that all the operating rooms in the hospital he works at are clean and sanitized and no cross infections. And cleans up after a bunch of people's really unfortunate days. It's a hard job and doesn't get a lot for it, so thank him for doing it, and this is for him. Chapter 1. Death Strikes a King. The king of Vindhya was dying. Through the hot, stifling night, the temple gongs boomed and the conchs roared. Their clamor was a faint echo in the gold-domed chamber where Bunda Chand struggled on the velvet-cushioned dais. Beads of sweat glistened on his dark skin. His fingers twisted the gold-worked fabric beneath him. He was young. No spear had touched him. No poison lurked in his wine. But his veins stood out like blue cords on his temples, and his eyes dilated with the nearness of death. Trembling slave girls knelt at the foot of the dais, and leaning down to him watched with passionate intensity was his sister, the Devi Yasmina. With her was the Wazam, a noble grown old in the royal court. She threw up her head in a gusty gesture of wrath and despair as the thunder of the distant drums reached her ears. "The priests, their clamor," she exclaimed. "They are no wiser than the leeches who are helpless. Nay, he dies and none can say why. He's dying now, and I stand here helpless, who would burn the whole city and spill the blood of thousands to save him." "Not a man of Adoya would but die in his place, if it might be, Devi," answered the Wazam. "This poison, I tell you it is not poison," she cried. "Since his birth he has been guarded so closely that the cleverest poisoners of the East could not reach him. 5 skulls bleaching on the towers of the kites can testify to attempts which were made, and which failed. As you well know, there are 10 men and 10 women whose sole duty is to taste his food and wine, and 50 armed guards guard his chambers as they guard it now. No, it is not poison. It is sorcery. Black, ghastly magic." Hey, Meg, welcome. Glad you could make it. Yeah, we're trying out a new time slot. Oh! You are right. Thank you. That's embarrassing. Sorry, guys. Yep, I'm playing with the new title cards and stuff like that and trying to improve things, and obviously I screwed that up. Hey, Vela, welcome. So, as we were, before I got pointed out that I had already screwed things up. She ceased as the king spoke. His livid lips did not move, and there was no recognition in his glassy eyes. But his voice rose in an eerie call, indistinct and far away, as if calling to her from beyond vast, wind-blown gulfs. "Yasmina, Yasmina, my sister, where are you? I cannot find you. All is darkness and the roaring of great winds." "Brother," cried Yasmina, catching his limp hand in a convulsive grasp, "I'm here. Do you not know me?" Her voice died at the utter vacancy of his face. A low, confused moan waned from his mouth. The slave girls at the foot of the dais whimpered with fear, and Yasmina beat her breast in anguish. In another part of the city, a man stood in a latticed balcony overlooking a long street in which torches tossed luridly, smokily revealing upturned dark faces and the whites of gleaming eyes. A long-drawn wailing rose from the multitude. The man shrugged his broad shoulders and turned back into the arabesque chamber. He was a tall man, compactly built and richly clad. "The king is not yet dead, but the dirge is sounded," he said to another man who sat cross-legged on a mat in a corner. This man was clad in a brown camel-hair robe and sandals, and a green turban was on his head. His expression was tranquil, his gaze impersonal. "The people know he will never see another dawn," this man answered. The first speaker favored him with a long, searching stare. "What I cannot understand," he said, "is why I have had to wait so long for your masters to strike. If they have slain the king now, why could they not have slain him months ago? Even the arts you call sorcery are governed by cosmic laws," answered the man in the green turban. "The stars direct these actions, as in other affairs. Not even my masters can alter the stars. Not until the heavens were in the proper order could they perform this necromancy." With a long, stained fingernail, he mapped the constellations on the marble-tiled floor. The slant of the moon presaged evil for the king of Vindaya. The stars are in turmoil, the serpent in the house of the elephant. During such juxtaposition, the invisible guardians are removed from the spirit of Bunda Khan. A path is opened in the unseen realms, and once a point of contact was established, mighty powers were put in play along that path. "Point of contact?" inquired the other. "Do you mean that lock of Bunda Khan's hair?" "Yes. All discarded portions of the human body still remain part of it, attached to it by intangible connections. The priests of Asura have a dim inkling of this truth, and so all nail trimmings, hair, and other waste products of the persons of the royal family are carefully reduced to ashes, and the ashes hidden. But at the urgent entreaty of the princess of Kosala, who loved Bundashan vainly, he gave her a lock of his long black hair as a token of remembrance. When my masters decided upon his doom, the lock, in its gold and jewel-encrusted case, was stolen from under her pillow while she slept, and another substituted, so like the first that she never knew the difference. Then the genuine lock traveled by camel caravan up the long, long road to Peshkari, thence up the Zybar Pass, until it reached the hands of those for whom it was intended." "Only a lock of hair," murmured the nobleman. "By which a soul is drawn from its body and across gulfs of echoing space," returned the man on the mat. The nobleman studied him curiously. "I do not know if you are a man or a demon, Kimsa," he said at last. "Few of us are what we seem. I, who the Kshatriyas know as Karim Shah, a prince from Aranistan, am no greater a masquerader than most men. They are all traitors in one way or another, and half of them know not whom they serve. There, at least, I have no doubts, for I serve King Yezdurud. Sorry, these names are a bit of a handful. For I serve King Yezdurud of Turan. And I, the black Sears of Yimsha, said Kimsa. And my masters are greater than yours, for they have accomplished by their arts what Yezdurud could not with 100,000 swords. Outside, the moan of the tortured thousands shuddered up to the stars, which crusted the sweating Vindayan night, and the conchs bellowed like oxen in pain. In the gardens of the palace, the torches glinted on polished helmets and curved swords and gold-chased corselets. All the noble-born fighting men of Ayodhya were gathered in the great palace, or about it, and at each broad-arched gate and door 50 archers stood on guard, with bows in their hands. But death stalked through the royal palace, and none could stay his ghostly tread. On the dais under the golden dome, the king cried out again, racked by awful paroxysms. Again his voice came faintly and far away, and again the Devi bent to him, trembling with a fear that was darker than the terror of death. Yasmina! Again that far, weirdly dreaming cry from realms immeasurable. Aid me! I am far from my mortal house. Wizards have drawn my soul through the wind-blown darkness. They seek to snap the silver cord that binds me to my dying body. They cluster around me. Their hands are taloned, their eyes are red like flame, burning in darkness. Aihi! Save me, my sister! Their fingers sear me like fire. They would slay my body and damn my soul. What is this they bring before me? Ai! At the terror in his hopeless cry, Yasmina screamed uncontrollably and threw herself bodily upon him in the abandon of her anguish. He was torn by a terrible convulsion. Foam flew from his contorted lips, and his writhing fingers left their marks on the girl's shoulders. But the glassy blankness passed from his eyes like smoke blown from a fire, and he looked up at his sister with recognition. "Brother," she sobbed. "Brother!" "Swift," he gasped, and his weakening voice was rational. "I know now what brings me to the pyre. I have been on a far journey, and I understand. I've been ensorcelled by the wizards of the Himalayas. They drew my soul out of my body and far away into a stone room. There they strove to break the silver cord of life and thrust my soul into the body of a foul night weird with their sorcery summoned up from hell. I feel their pull upon me now. Your cry and the grip of your fingers brought me back, but I am going fast. My soul clings to my body, but its hold weakens. Quick, kill me before they can trap my soul forever." "I cannot," she wailed, smiting her naked breasts. "Swiftly I command you." There was the old imperious note in his failing whisper. "You have never disobeyed me. Obey my last command. Send my soul clean to Asura. Haste, lest you damn me to spend eternity as a filthy gaunt of darkness. Strike, I command you. Strike!" Sobbing wildly, Yasmina plucked a jeweled dagger from her girdle and plunged it to the hilt in his breast. He stiffened and then went limp, a grim smile curving his dead lips. Yasmina hurled herself face down on the rush-covered floor, beating the reeds with her clenched hands. Outside, the gongs and conchs brayed and thundered, and the priests gashed themselves with copper knives. Chapter 2. A Barbarian from the Hills. Chunder Shan, governor of Peshkari, laid down his golden pen and carefully scanned that which he had written on parchment that bore his official seal. He had ruled Peshkari so long only because he weighed his every word, spoken or written. Danger breeds caution, and only a wary man lives long in that wild country where the hot Vindhyan plains meet the crags of the Himalayas. An hour's ride westward or northward, and one crossed the border and was among the hills where men lived by the law of the knife. The governor was alone in his chamber, seated at his ornately carven table of inlaid ebony. Through the wide window, open for coolness, he could see a square of the blue Himalayan night, dotted with great white stars. An adjacent parapet was a shadowy line, and further crenelles and embrasures were barely hinted at in the dim starlight. The governor's fortress was strong, and situated outside the walls of the city it guarded. The breeze that stirred the tapestries on the wall brought faint noises from the streets of Peshkari, occasional snatches of wailing song, or the thrum of a cithern. The governor read what he had written, slowly, with his open hand shading his eyes from the bronze butter lamp, his lips moving. Absently as he read, he heard the drum of horses' hooves outside the barbican, the sharp staccato of the guard's challenge. He did not heed, intent upon his letter. It was addressed to the Wazam of Vindhya at the royal court of Ayodhya, and it stated, after the customary salutations, "Let it be known to your excellency that I have faithfully carried out your excellency's instructions. The 7 tribesmen are well guarded in their prison, and I have repeatedly sent word into the hills that their chief come in person to bargain for their release. But he has made no move, except to send word that unless they are freed, he will burn Peshkari and cover his saddle with my hide, begging your excellency's indulgence. This he is quite capable of attempting, and I have tripled the members of the Lance Guards. The man is not a native of Gulistan. I cannot with certainty predict his next move, but since it is the wish of the Devi—" He was out of his ivory chair and on his feet facing the arched door, all in one instant. He snatched at the curved sword laying in its ornate scabbard on the table, and then checked the movement. It was a woman who had entered unannounced, a woman whose gossamer robes did not conceal the rich garments beneath them any more than they concealed the suppleness and beauty of her tall, slender figure. A filmy veil fell below her breasts, supported by a flowing headdress bound about with a triple gold braid and adorned with a golden crescent. Her dark eyes regarded the astonished governor over the veil, and then, with an imperious gesture of her white hand, she uncovered her face. "Devi!" The governor dropped to his knees before her, surprise and confusion somewhat spoiling the stateliness of his obeisance. With a gesture she motioned him to rise, and he hastened to lead her to the ivory chair, all the while bowing level with his girdle. But his first words were of reproof. "Your Majesty, this was most unwise. The border is unsettled. Raids from the hills are incessant. You came with a large attendance?" "An ample revenue followed me to Peshkari," she answered. "I lodged my people there and came onto the fort with my maid, Gitara." Chandrashan groaned in horror. "Devi, you do not understand the peril. An hour's ride from this spot, the hills swarm with barbarians who make a profession of murder and rapine. Women have been stolen and men stabbed between the fort and the city. Peshkari is not like your southern provinces." "But I am here and unharmed," she interrupted with a trace of impatience. "I showed my signet ring to the guard at the door and to the one outside your door, and they admitted me unannounced, not knowing me, but supposing me to be a secret courier from Ayodhya. Let us not now waste time." "You have received no word from the chief of the barbarians?" "None save threats and curses, Devi. He is wary and suspicious. He deems it a trap, and perhaps he is not to be blamed. The Kshatriyas have not always kept their promises to the hill people." "He must be brought to terms," broke in Yasmina, the knuckles of her clenched hand showing white. I don't understand." The governor shook his head. "When I chanced to capture these 7 hillmen, I reported their capture to the Wazam as is the custom, and then, before I could hang them, there came an order to hold them and communicate with their chief. This I did, but the man holds aloof, as I have said. These men are of the tribe of Afghulis, but he is a foreigner from the west, and he is called Conan. I've threatened to hang them tomorrow at dawn if he does not come." "Good," exclaimed the Devi. "You have done well, and I will tell you why I have given these orders." My brother, she faltered, choking, and the governor bowed his head, with the customary gesture of respect for a departed sovereign. "The king of Vindhya was destroyed by magic," she said at last. "I have devoted my life to the destruction of his murderers. As he died, he gave me a clue, and I have followed it. I have read the Book of Skelos and talked with nameless hermits in the caves below July. I learned how and by whom he was destroyed. His enemies were the black Sears of Mount Yimsha." "Asura," whispered Chandrashan, paling. Her eyes knifed him through. "Do you fear them?" "Who does not, your majesty?" he replied. "They are black devils haunting the uninhabited hills beyond the Zybar. But the sages say that they seldom interfere in the lives of mortal men." "Why they slew my brother I do not know," she answered. "But I have sworn on the altar of Asura to destroy them, and I need the aid of a man beyond the border. A Kshatriya army unaided would never reach Yamsha." "Aye," muttered Chandrashan. "You speak the truth there. It would be fight every step of the way, with hairy hillmen hurling down boulders from every height and rushing us with their long knives in every valley. The Turanians fought their way through the Himalayas once, but how many returned to Kurusun? Few of those who escaped the swords of Kshatriyas after the king, your brother, defeated their host on the Jumda River ever saw Sakundaram again." "And so I must control men across the border," she said. "Men who know the way to Mount Yamsha." But the tribes fear the black Sears and shun the unholy mountain, broke in the governor. Does the chief, Conan, fear them? She asked. Well, as to that, muttered the governor, I doubt if there's anything that devil fears. So I have been told. Therefore, he is the man I must deal with. He wishes the release of his 7 men? Very well. Their ransom shall be the heads of the black Sears. Her voice thrummed with hate as she uttered the last words, and her hands clenched at her sides. She looked an image of incarnate passion as she stood there, with her head thrown high and her bosom heaving. Again the governor knelt, for part of his wisdom was the knowledge that a woman in such an emotional tempest is as perilous as a blind cobra to any about her. It shall be as you wish, your majesty. Then, as she presented a calmer aspect, he rose and ventured to drop a word of warning. I cannot predict what the chief Conan's action will be. The tribesmen are always turbulent, and I have reason to believe that emissaries from the Turanians are stirring them up to raid our borders. As your majesty knows, the Turanians have established themselves in Secundurum and other northern cities, though the hill tribes remain unconquered. King Yezdegerd has long looked southward with greedy lust, and is perhaps seeking to gain by treachery what he could not win by force of arms. I have thought that Conan might well be one of his spies. We shall see, she answered. If he loves his followers, he will be at the gates at dawn to parley. I shall spend the night in the fortress. I came in disguise to Peshkari, and lodged my retinue at an inn instead of the palace. Besides my people, only yourself knows of my presence here. I shall escort you to your quarters, your majesty, said the governor, and as they emerged from the doorway, he beckoned the warrior on guard there, and the man fell in behind them, spear held at salute. The maid waited, veiled like her mistress, outside the door, and the group traversed a wide, winding corridor, lighted by smoking torches, and reached the quarters reserved for visiting notables, generals and viceroys mostly. None of the royal family had ever honored the fortress before. Chandrashan had a perturbed feeling that the suite was not suitable to such an exalted personage as the Devi, and though she sought to make him feel at ease in her presence, he was glad when she dismissed him, and he bowed himself out. All the menials of the fort had been summoned to serve his royal guest, though he did not divulge her identity, and he stationed a squad of spearmen before her doors, among them the warrior who had guarded his own chamber. In his preoccupation, he forgot to replace the man. The governor had not been long gone from her when Yasmina suddenly remembered something else which she had wished to discuss with him, but had forgotten until that moment. It concerned the past actions of one Kerim Shah, a nobleman from Aranistan, who had dwelt for a while in Peshkari before coming on to the court at Ayoda. A vague suspicion concerning the man had been stirred by a glimpse of him in Peshkari that night. She wondered if he had followed her from Ayoda. Being a truly remarkable Devi, she did not summon the governor to her again, but hurried out into the corridor alone and hastened to his chamber. Chandrashan, entering his chamber, closed the door and went to his table. There, he took the letter he had been writing and tore it to bits. Scarcely had he finished when he heard something drop softly onto the parapet adjacent to the window. He looked up to see a figure loom briefly against the stars, and then a man dropped lightly into the room. The light glinted on a long sheen of steel in his hand. "Shh," he warned. "Don't make a noise, or I'll send the devil a henchman." The governor checked his motion toward the sword on the table. He was within reach of the yard-long Zyber knife that glittered in the intruder's fist, and he knew the desperate quickness of a hillman. Yeah, let's get rid of spam. How do I get rid of that? Okay, sorry guys. I do not have it set up to allow me to just instantly remove messages like that yet. I am still learning this stuff. But please, for the love of God, do not follow that link. The invader was a tall man, at once strong and supple. He was dressed like a hillman, but his dark features and blazing blue eyes did not match his garb. Chunder Shan had never seen a man like him, but he was not an Easterner, but some barbarian from the west. His aspect was as untamed and formidable as any of the hairy tribesmen who haunt the hills of Gulistan. "You come like a thief in the night," commented the governor, recovering some of his composure, although he remembered that there was no guard within call. Still, the hillman could not know that. "I climbed a bastion," snarled the intruder. "A guard thrust his head over the battlement in time for me to rap it with my knife hilt." "You were Conan?" "Who else? You sent word into the hills that you wished for me to come and parley with you. Well, by Crom, I've come. Keep away from that table, or I'll gut you." "I merely wish to seat myself," answered the governor, carefully sinking into the ivory chair, which he wheeled away from the table. Conan moved restlessly before him, glancing suspiciously at the door, thumbing the razor edge of his 3-foot knife. He did not walk like an Afghuli, and was bluntly direct where the East is subtle. "You have 7 of my men," he said abruptly. "You refused the ransom I offered. What the devil do you want?" "Let us discuss terms," answered Chunder Shan cautiously. "Terms?" There was a timbre of dangerous anger in his voice. "What do you mean? Haven't I offered you gold?" Chunder Shan laughed. "Gold? There is more gold in Peshkari than you ever saw." "You're a liar," retorted Conan. "I've seen the souk of the goldsmiths in Kurasum." "Well, more than an Afghuli ever saw," amended Chunder Shan. "And it is but a drop of all the treasure of Vindhya. Why should we desire gold? It would be more to our advantage to hang these 7 thieves." Conan ripped out a sulphurous oath, and the long blade quivered in his grip as the muscles rose in ridges on his brown arm. "I'll split your head like a ripe melon." A wild blue flame flickered in the hillman's eyes, but Chunder Shan shrugged his shoulders, though keeping an eye on the keen steel. "You can kill me easily, and probably escape over the wall afterward, but that would not save the 7 tribesmen. My men would surely hang them, and these men are headmen among the Afghulis." "I know it," snarled Conan. "The tribe is baying like wolves at my heels because I have not procured their release. Tell me in plain words what you want, because by Crom, if there's no other way, I'll raise a horde and lead it to the very gates of Peshkari." Looking at the man as he stood squarely, knife in fist and eyes glaring, Chunder Shan did not doubt that he was capable of it. The governor did not believe any hill horde could take Peshkari, but he did not wish a devastated countryside. "There is a mission you must perform," he said, choosing his words with as much care as if they had been razors. "There—" Conan had sprung back, wheeling to face the door at the same instant, lips a-snarl. His barbarian ears had caught the quick tread of soft slippers outside the door. The next instant, the door was thrown open, and a slim, silk-robed form entered hastily, pulling the door shut, then stopping short at the sight of the hillman. Chunder Shan sprang up, his heart jumping into his mouth. "Devi!" he cried involuntarily, losing his head momentarily in his fright. "Devi?" It was like an explosive echo from the hillman's lips. Chunder Shan saw recognition and intent flame up in the fierce blue eyes. The governor shouted desperately and caught at his sword, but the hillman moved with the devastating speed of a hurricane. He sprang, knocked the governor sprawling with the savage blow of his knife hilt, and swept up the astounded Devi in one brawny arm and leaped for the window. Chunder Shan, struggling frantically to his feet, saw the man poise an instant on the sill, in a flutter of silken skirts and white limbs that was his royal captive, and heard his fierce, exultant snarl. "Now dare to hang my men!" And then Conan leaped to the parapet and was gone. A wild scream floated back to the governor's ears. "Guard! Guard!" screamed the governor, screaming up and running drunkenly to the door. He tore it open and reeled into the hall. His shouts re-echoed along the corridors, and warriors came running, gaping to see the governor holding his broken head from which the blood streamed. "Turn out the lancers!" he roared. "There's been an abduction!" Even in his frenzy, he had enough sense left to withhold the full truth. He stopped short as he heard a sudden drum of hoofs outside, a frantic scream and a wild yell of barbaric exultation. Followed by the bewildered guardsmen, the governor raced for the stair. In the courtyard of the fort, a force of lancers stood by saddled steeds, ready to ride in an instant's notice. Chandrashan led his squadron flying after the fugitive, though his head swam, so he had to hold with both hands to the saddle. He did not divulge the identity of the victim, but said merely that the noblewoman who had borne the royal signet ring had been carried away by the chief of the Afghulis. The abductor was out of sight and hearing, but they knew the path he would strike, the road that runs straight to the mouth of the Zybar. There was no moon. Peasant huts rose dimly in the starlight. Behind them fell away the grim bastion of the fort and the towers of Peshkari. Ahead of them loomed the black walls of the Himalayas. Chapter 3. Kimsa uses magic. In the confusion that reigned in the fortress while the guard was being turned out, no one noticed that the girl who had accompanied the Devi slipped out the great arched gate and vanished in the darkness. She ran straight for the city, her garments tucked high. She did not follow the open road, but cut straight through the fields and over slopes, avoiding fences and leaping irrigation ditches as surely as if it were broad daylight, and as easily as if she were a trained masculine runner. The hoof drum of the guardsman had faded away up the hill before she reached the city wall. She did not go to the great gate, beneath whose arch men leaned on spears and craned their necks into the darkness, discussing the unwanted activity at the fortress. She skirted the wall until she reached a certain point where the spire of the tower was visible above the battlements. Then she placed her hands to her mouth and voiced a low, weird call that carried strangely. Almost immediately, a head appeared at the embrasure, and a rope came wriggling down the wall. She seized it, placed a foot in the loop at the end, and waved her arm. Then quickly and smoothly she was drawn up the sheer stone curtain. An instant later, she scrambled over the merlons and stood upon a flat roof which covered a house that was built against the wall. There was an open trap there, and a man in a camel-hair robe who silently coiled the rope, not showing in any way the strain of hauling a full-grown woman up a 40-foot wall. "Where is Karim Shah?" she gasped, panting after her long run. "Asleep in the house below. You have news?" "Conan has stolen the Devi out of the fortress and carried her away into the hills." She blurted out her news in a rush, the words stumbling over one another. Kimsa showed no emotion, but merely nodded his turbaned head. "Karim Shah will be glad to hear that," he said. "Wait!" The girl threw her supple arms about his neck. She was panting hard, but not only from exertion. Her eyes blazed like black jewels in the starlight. Her upturned face was close to Kimsa's, but though he submitted to her embrace, he did not return it. "Do not tell the Hyrcanian," she panted. "Let us use this knowledge ourselves. The governor has gone into the hills with his riders, but he might as well chase a ghost. He has not told anyone that it was the Devi who was kidnapped. None in Peshkari or the fort knows it except us." "But what good does it do us?" the man expostulated. "My master sent me with Karim Shah to aid him in every way." "Aid yourself," she cried fiercely. "Shake off your yoke." "You mean disobey my masters?" he gasped, and she felt his whole body turn cold under her arms. "Aye," she shook him in the fury of her emotion. "You too are a magician. Why will you be a slave, using your powers only to elevate others? Use your arts for yourself." "That is forbidden." He was shaking as if with an ague. "I am not one of the Black Circle. Only by the command of the masters do I dare to use the knowledge they have taught me." "But you can use it," she argued passionately. "Do as I beg you. Of course Conan has taken the Devi to hold as hostage against the 7 tribesmen in the governor's prison. Destroy them, so Chandrashan cannot use them to buy back the Devi. Then let us go into the mountains and take her from the Afghulis. They cannot stand against your sorcery with their knives. The treasure of the Vendayan kings will be ours as ransom, and then, when we have it in our hands, we can trick them and sell her to the king of Turan. We shall have wealth beyond our maddest dreams. With it, we can buy warriors. We can take Corbu, oust the Turanians from the hills, and send our host southward. Become king and queen of an empire. Man, she's got big dreams. Kimsa, too, was panting, shaking like a leaf in her grasp. His face showed gray in the starlight, beaded with great drops of perspiration. I love you, she cried fiercely, writhing her body against his, almost strangling him in her wild embrace, shaking him in her abandon. I will make a king of you. For love of you, I betrayed my mistress. For love of me, betray your masters. Why fear the black Sears? By your love for me, you have already broken one of their laws already. Break the rest. You are as strong as they. A man of ice could not have withstood the searing heat of her passion and fury. With an inarticulate cry, he crushed her to him, bending her backward and showering gasping kisses on her eyes, face, and lips. I'll do it. His voice was thick with laboring emotions. He staggered like a drunken man. The arts they have taught me shall work for me, not for my masters. We shall be rulers of the world. Of the world! Come then. Twisting lightly out of his embrace, she seized his hand and led him toward the trapdoor. First, we must make sure that the governor does not exchange those 7 Afghulis for the Devi. He moved like a man in a daze until they had descended a ladder, and she paused in the chamber below. Kerim Shah lay on a couch motionless, an arm across his face as though to shield his sleeping eyes from the soft light of a brass lamp. She plucked Kimsa's arm and made a quick gesture across her own throat. Kimsa lifted his hand. Then his expression changed and he drew away. I have eaten his salt, he muttered. Besides, he cannot interfere with us. He led the girl through a door that opened on a winding stair. After their soft tread had faded into silence, the man on the couch sat up. Kerim Shah wiped the sweat from his face. A knife thrust he did not dread, but he feared Kimsa as a man fears a poisonous reptile. People who plot on roofs should remember to lower their voices, he muttered. But as Kimsa has turned against his masters, and he was my only contact between them, I can count on their aid no longer. From now on, I play the game in my own way. Rising to his feet, he went quickly to a table, drew pen and parchment from his girdle, and scribbled a few succinct lines. To Khosru Khan, governor of Secundaram, the Cimmerian Conan has carried the Devi Yasmina to the villages of the Afghulis. It is an opportunity to get the Devi into our hands, as the king has so long desired. Send 3,000 horsemen at once. I will meet them in the valley of Gura Shah with native guides. And he signed it with a name that was not in the least like Kerim Shah. Then, from a golden cage, he drew forth a carrier pigeon, to whose leg he made fast the parchment, rolled into a tiny cylinder, and secured with gold wire. Then he went quickly to a casement and tossed the bird into the night. It wavered on fluttering wings, balanced, and was gone like a flitting shadow. Catching up helmet, sword, and cloak, Kerim Shah hurried out of the chamber and down the winding stair. The prison quarters of Peshkari were separated from the rest of the city by a massive wall, in which was set a single iron-bound door under an arch. Over the arch burned a lurid red cresset, and beside the door squatted a warrior with spear and shield. This warrior, leaning on his spear and yawning from time to time, started suddenly to his feet. He had not thought he had dozed, but a man was standing before him, a man he had not heard approach. The man wore a camel hair robe. Hey, thanks for the follow, Roadhouse. Glad you could join us. In the flickering light of the cresset, his features were shadowy, but a pair of lambent eyes shone surprisingly in the lurid glow. Who comes? Demanded the warrior, presenting his spear. Who are you? The stranger did not seem perturbed, though the spear point touched his bosom. His eyes held the warrior's with a strange intensity. What are you obliged to do? He asked strangely. To guard the gate. The warrior spoke thickly and mechanically. He stood rigid as a statue, his eyes slowly glazing. You lie. You are obliged to obey me. You have looked into my eyes, and your soul is no longer your own. Open that door. Stiffly, with the wooden features of an image, the guard wheeled about, drew a great key from his girdle, turned it in the massive lock, and swung open the door. Then he stood at attention, his unseeing stare straight ahead of him. A woman glided from the shadows and laid an eager hand on the mesmerist's arm. "Bid him fetch his horses, Kimsa," she whispered. "No need of that," answered the Raksha. Lifting his voice slightly, he spoke to the guardsman. "I have no more use for you. Kill yourself." Like a man in a trance, the warrior thrust the butt of his spear against the base of the wall and placed the keen head against his body, just below the ribs. Then slowly, stolidly, he leaned against it with all his weight, so that it transfixed his body and came out between his shoulders. Sliding down the shaft, he lay still, the spear jutting above him its full length, like a horrible stalk growing out of his back. The girl stared down at him in morbid fascination until Kimsa took her arm and led her through the gate. Torches lighted a narrow space between the outer wall and a lower inner one, in which were arched doors at regular intervals. A warrior paced this enclosure, and when the gate opened, he came sauntering up, so secure in his knowledge of the prison's strength that he was not suspicious until Kimsa and the girl emerged from the archway. Then it was too late. The Raksha did not waste time in hypnotism, though his actions savored of magic to the girl. The guard lowered his spear threateningly, opening his mouth to shout an alarm that would bring spearmen swarming out of the guardrooms at either end of the alleyway. Kimsa flicked the spear aside with his left hand, as a man might flick a straw, and his right flashed out and back, seeming gently to caress the warrior's neck in passing. And the guard pitched on his face without a sound, his head lolling on a broken neck. Kimsa did not glance at him, but went straight to one of the arched doors and placed his open hand against the heavy bronze lock. With a rending shudder, the portal buckled inward. As the girl followed him through, she saw that the thick teakwood hung in splinters. The bronze bolts were bent and twisted from their sockets, and the great hinges broken and disjointed. 1,000-pound battering ram with 40 men to swing it could not have shattered the barrier more completely. Kimsa was drunk with freedom and the exercise of his power, glorying in his might and flinging his strength about as a young giant exercises his thews with unnecessary vigor and the exultant pride of his prowess. The broken door led them into a small courtyard lit by a cresset. Opposite the door was a wide grille of iron bars. A hairy hand was visible, gripping one of these bars, and in the darkness behind them glimmered the whites of eyes. Kimsa stood silent for a space, gazing into the shadows from which those glimmering eyes gave back his stare with burning intensity. Then his hand went into his robe and came out again, and from his opening fingers a shimmering feather of sparkling dust sifted to the flags. Instantly, a flare of green fire lighted the enclosure. In the brief glare, the forms of 7 men, standing motionless behind the bars, were limned in vivid detail. Tall, hairy men in ragged hillmen's garments. They did not speak, but in their eyes blazed the fear of death, and their hairy fingers gripped the bar. The fire died out, but the glow remained, a quivering ball of lambent green that pulsed and shimmered on the flags before Kimsa's feet. The wide gaze of the tribesman was fixed upon it. It wavered, elongated. It turned into a luminous green smoke spiraling upward. It twisted and writhed like a great shadowy serpent, then broadened and billowed out in shining folds and whirls. It grew to a cloud, moving silently over the flags, straight toward the grill. The men watched its coming with dilated eyes. The bars quivered with the grip of their desperate fingers. Bearded lips parted, but no sound came forth. The green cloud rolled on the bars and blotted them from sight. Like a fog, it oozed through the grill and hid the men within. From the enveloping folds came a strangled gasp, as of a man plunged suddenly under the surface of water. And that was all. Kimsa touched the girl's arm as she stood with parted lips and dilated eyes. Mechanically, she turned away with him, looking back over her shoulder. Already the mist was thinning. Close to the bars she saw a pair of sandaled feet, the toes turned upward. she glimpsed the indistinct outlines of 7 still, prostrate shapes. And now, for a steed swifter than the fastest horse ever bred in a mortal stable, Kimsa was saying, we will be in Afghanistan before dawn. Chapter 4. An Encounter in the Pass. Yasmina Devi could never clearly remember the details of her abduction. The unexpectedness and violence stunned her. She had only a confused impression of a world of happenings, the terrifying grip of a mighty arm, the blazing eyes of her abductor, and his hot breath burning on her flesh. The leap through the window to the parapet, the mad race across battlements and roofs when the fear of falling froze her, the reckless descent of a rope bound to a merlin. He went down almost at a run, his captive folded limply over his brawny shoulder. All this was a befuddled tangle in the Devi's mind. She retained a more vivid memory of him running fleetly into the shadows of the trees, carrying her like a child, and vaulting into the saddle of a fierce Balkana stallion which reared and snorted. Then there was a sensation of flying, and the racing hooves were striking sparks of fire from the flinty road as the stallion swept up the slopes. As the girl's mind cleared, her first sensations were furious rage and shame. She was appalled. The rulers of the Golden Kingdom south of the Himalayas were considered little short of divine, and she was the Devi of Vindhya. Fright was submerged in regal wrath. She cried out furiously and began struggling. She, Yasmina, to be carried on the saddle-bow of a hill chief like a common wench of the marketplace. He merely hardened his massive thews slightly against her writhings, and for the first time in her life she experienced the coercion of superior physical strength. His arms felt like iron about her slender limbs. He glanced down at her and grinned hugely. His teeth glimmered whitely in the starlight. The reins lay loose on the stallion's flowing mane, and every thew and fiber of the great beast strained as he hurtled along the boulder-strewn trail. But Conan sat easily, almost carelessly, in the saddle, riding like a centaur. "You hill-bred dog," she panted, quivering with the impact of shame, anger, and the realization of helplessness. You dare! Your life shall pay for this! Where are you taking me?" "To the villages of Afghanistan," he answered, casting a glance over his shoulder. Behind them, beyond the slopes they had traveled, torches were tossing on the walls of the fortress, and he glimpsed a flare of light that had meant the great gate had been opened. And he laughed, a deep-throated boom gusty as the hill wind. "The governor has sent his riders after us," he laughed. "By Crom, we will lead him a merry chase. What do you think, Devi? Will they pay 7 lives for a Kashai... Oh my God, these names. Kshaitra princess? They will send an army to hang you and your spawn of devils," she promised him with conviction. He laughed gustily and shifted her to a more comfortable position in his arms. But she took this as a fresh outrage and renewed her vain struggle until she saw that her efforts were only amusing him. Besides, her light silken garments, floating on the wind, were being outrageously disarranged by her struggles. She concluded that a scornful submission was the better part of dignity and lapsed into a smoldering quiescence. She felt even her anger being submerged by awe as they entered the mouth of the pass, lowering like a black well mouth in the blacker walls that rose like colossal ramparts to bar their way. It was as if a gigantic knife had cut the Zybar out of walls of solid rock. On either hand, sheer slopes pitched up for thousands of feet, and the mouth of the pass was dark as hate. Even Conan could not see with any accuracy, but he knew the road, even by night, and knowing that armed men were racing through the starlight after him, he did not check the stallion's speed. The great brute was not yet showing fatigue. He thundered along the road that followed the valley bed, labored up a slope, swept along a low ridge where treacherous shale on either hand lurked for the unwary, and came upon a trail that followed the lap of the left-hand wall. Not even Conan could spy, in that darkness, an ambush set by the Zybar tribesmen. As they swept past the black mouth of a gorge that opened into the pass, a javelin swished through the air and thudded home behind the stallion's straining shoulder. The great beast let out his life in a shuddering sob and stumbled, going headlong into mid-stride. But Conan had recognized the flight and stroke of the javelin, and he acted with spring steel quickness. As the horse fell, he leaped clear, holding the girl aloft to guard her from striking boulders. He lit on his feet like a cat, thrust her into the cleft of rock, and wheeled toward the outer darkness, drawing his knife. Yasmina, confused by the rapidity of events, not quite sure just what had happened, saw a vague shape rush out of the darkness, bare feet slapping softly on the rock, ragged garments whipping on the wind of his haste. She glimpsed the flicker of steel, heard the lightning crack of stroke, parry, and counterstroke, and the crunch of bone as Conan's long knife split the other's skull. Conan sprang back, crouching in the shelter of the rocks. Out in the night, men were moving, and a stentorian voice roared, "What, you dogs? Do you flinch? In, curse you, and take them!" Conan started, peered into the darkness, and lifted his voice. "Yar Afzal? Is it you?" There sounded a startled imprecation, and the voice called warily. "Conan? Is it you, Conan?" "Aye," the Cimmerian laughed. "Come forth, you old war dog. I've slain one of your men." There was movement among the rocks. A light flared dimly, and then a flame appeared and came bobbing toward him, and as it approached, a fierce, bearded countenance grew out of the darkness. The man who carried it held it high, thrust forward, and craned his neck to peer among the boulders it lighted. The other hand gripped a great, curved tulwar. Conan stepped forward, sheathing his knife, and the other roared a greeting. "Aye, it is Conan! Come out of your rocks, dogs! It is Conan!" Others pressed into the wavering circle of light, wild, ragged, bearded men, with eyes like wolves, and long blades in their fists. They did not see Yasmina, for she was hidden by Conan's massive body. But peeping from her covert, she knew icy fear for the first time that night. These men were more like wolves than human beings. "What are you hunting in the Zybar by night, Yar Afzal?" Conan demanded of the burly chief, who grinned like a bearded ghoul. "Who knows what might come up the pass after dark? We Wazulis are nighthawks. But what of you, Conan?" "I have a prisoner," answered the Cimmerian, and moving aside he disclosed the cowering girl. Reaching a long arm into the crevice, he drew her trembling forth. Her imperious bearing was gone. She stared timidly at the ring of bearded faces that hemmed her in, and was grateful for the strong arm that clasped her possessively. The torch was thrust close to her, and there was a sucking intake of breath about the ring. "She is my captive," Conan warned, glancing pointedly at the feet of the man he had slain, just visible within the ring of light. "I was taking her to Afghanistan, but now you have slain my horse, and the Kshatriyas are close behind me." "Come with us to my village," suggested Yar Afzal. "We have horses hidden in the gorge. They can never follow us in the darkness." "They are close behind, you say?" "So close that I hear now the clink of their hoofs on the flint," answered Conan grimly. Instantly there was movement. The torch was dashed out, and the ragged shapes melted like phantoms into the darkness. Conan swept up the Devi in his arms, and she did not resist. The rocky ground hurt her slim feet in their soft slippers, and she felt very small and helpless in that brutish, primordial blackness among those colossal, nighted crags. Feeling her shiver in the wind that moaned down the defiles, Conan jerked a ragged cloak from its owner's shoulders and wrapped it about her. He also hissed a warning in her ear, ordering her to make no sound. She did not hear the distant clink of shod hooves on rock that warned the keen-eared hillman, but she was far too frightened to disobey in any event. She could see nothing but a few faint stars far above, but she knew by the deepening darkness when they entered the gorge mouth. There was a stir about them, the uneasy movement of horses. A few muttered words, and Conan mounted the horse of the man he had killed, lifting the girl up in front of him. Like phantoms, except for the click of their hooves, the band swept away up the shadowy gorge. Behind them on the trail they left the dead horse and the dead man, which were found less than half an hour later by the riders from the fortress, who recognized the man as a Wazuli and drew their own conclusions accordingly. Yasmina, snuggled warmly in her captor's arms, grew drowsy in spite of herself. The motion of the horse, though it was uneven, uphill and down, yet possessed a certain rhythm, which combined with weariness and emotional exhaustion to force sleep upon her. She had lost all sense of time or direction. They moved in soft, thick darkness, in which she sometimes glimpsed vaguely gigantic walls streaming up like black ramparts, or great crags shouldering the stars. At times, she sensed echoing depths beneath them, or felt the wind of dizzy heights blowing cold about her. Gradually, these things faded into a dreamy unwakefulness, in which the clink of hooves and the creak of saddles were like the irrelevant sounds in a dream. She was vaguely aware when the motion ceased, and she was lifted down and carried a few steps. Then she was laid down on something soft and rustling, and something, a folded coat perhaps, was thrust under her head, and the cloak in which she was wrapped was carefully tucked about her. She heard Yaroff Zal laugh. "A rare prize, Conan. Fit mate for a chief of the Afghulis." "Not for me," came Conan's unstirring rumble. "This wench will buy the lives of my 7 headmen, blast to their souls." That was the last she heard as she sank into dreamless slumber. All right. Time for intermission. We'll take a quick break right there, and we'll resume in about 5 minutes. And while you're here, before you step away from your device or wherever you're listening, if you could please scroll down just a little bit and hit that follow button, I would deeply appreciate it. It's the best way to support the stream right now, and it means a lot. So please, go ahead and scroll down, hit the follow. If you want to join me on YouTube, you can like and subscribe there. If you don't have a Twitch account yet, they are free and easy to set up. It's the simplest thing you could do. You could even do it before we start the book again. Anyway, thank you very much. Take a couple minutes, and I'm going to finish my cup of tea. If anybody has any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask me anything in the chat, and I'll try to respond. Some things I won't answer, but most things. Yes, we do. I agree. I just hope we can find a timer we can do that I don't need to install Windows 10 for. No plans. Do you have time? Do you want to work on it? By the way, for those of you who are listening, Megster88 here is kind of my Yoda for this streaming thing. She's been mentoring me through this. Okay. I'm going to go with none because I have no cats available. Used to have a cat, but no more cat. Cat went bye-bye. Well, I can hardly experiment and find out if I don't have any cats to practice with. I mean, I'm not going to order cats just to shove them in a pillowcase. That's a bit mean, don't you think? It's true. Breed too. I mean, are we talking Mancoons, or are we, talking something a little smaller? In any case, to be honest, I'm not going to put a cat in a pillowcase because that's just mean. I might put silly outfits on it, though, because that's funny. And apparently, for some reason, a poll activated? That is not supposed to be in this one. I do own a pillowcase, a couple, and thank you, Raskolnikov. That poll was supposed to activate for the Agatha Christie reading tomorrow. And it's not done yet, which is why there's only one option. But, okay, Meg. Why did the poll activate if it's not actually on this scene? It's not enabled for this one at all. So why did it pop in like that? And why now? I didn't activate it. Oh, okay. All right. So after this, you want to show me how to turn that off? Please? Yeah. So those of you who are following, I hope you have patience with the shenanigans as I learn all of this. I actually only started about a week ago. Before that, I did not even have a Twitch account. I didn't have, believe it or not, a YouTube account. I always watched YouTube like unsigned in. I didn't do Reddit. I didn't do social media at all. So, yeah, I am probably the noobiest noob for this stuff you will encounter. Okay, so when I open the Streamlabs website, there should just be an option there with a slider. All right. Well, well, I appreciate the forgiveness on the pronunciations. So it would be Kshatriya, is that right? Are there any other ones that well, I know I mangled them, but that you can help me with the pronunciation for? Thanks, Meg. Kshatri? Yeah. Okay. Kshatriya. Is that better? All right. Well, I'll tell you, that's a lot easier to say then, so we will do that from now on. All right. Well, I guess we'll dive back into it. I thought that this book was shorter than it's turned out to be. Like all the books we read on here, this is brand new to me. So I have no idea what's going to happen. This is an awful image, Meg. Really awful. Thank you. Thanks for bearing with me on the pronunciations on that. But we're going to cut off at the 2-hour mark. And then I guess we'll pick this one up. Oh, I could do next week the same time. I don't think there's another day this week that I can do this time slot, though. So we'll have to do it next week for the remainder of the book. We'll probably get to about the halfway mark. All right. So back to the story, everyone. She slept while armed men rode through the dark hills, and the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. Through the shadowy gorges and defiles that night there rang the hooves of galloping horses, and the starlight glimmered on helmets and curved blades, until the ghoulish shapes that haunt the crags stared into the darkness from ravine and boulder, and wondered what things were afoot. A band of these sat gaunt horses in the black pit mouth of a gorge as the hurrying hooves swept past. Their leader, a well-built man in a helmet and gilt-braided cloak, held up his hand warningly until the riders had sped on. Then he laughed softly. They must have lost the trail. Or else they have found that Conan has already reached the Afghuli villages. It will take many riders to smoke out that hive. There will be squadrons riding up the Zybar by dawn. If there's fighting in the hills, there will be looting, muttered a voice behind him, in the dialect of the Irakzai. There will be looting, answered the man with the helmet. But first, it is our business to reach the valley of Gurasha, and await the riders that will be galloping southward from Secundarum before daylight. He lifted his reins and rode out of the defile, his men falling in behind him, 30 ragged phantoms in the starlight. Chapter 5. The Black Stallion. I think that's a very, very different story, The Black Stallion. Or is it Black Stallion or Black Beauty that I'm thinking of? Or maybe there's one of each. In any case, the sun was well up when Yasmina awoke. She did not start and stare blankly, wondering where she was. She awoke with full knowledge of all that had occurred. Her supple limbs were stiff from her long ride, and her firm flesh seemed to feel the contact of that muscular arm that had borne her so far. She was lying on a sheepskin, covering a pallet of leaves on a hard-beaten dirt floor. A folded sheepskin coat was under her head, and she was wrapped in a ragged cloak. She was in a large room, the walls of which were crudely but strongly built of uncut rocks, plastered with sun-baked mud. Heavy beams supported a roof of the same kind, in which showed a trap-door up to which led a ladder. There were no windows in the thick walls, only loopholes. There was one door, a sturdy bronze affair that must have been looted from some Vindayan border tower. Opposite it was a wide opening in the wall, with no door but several strong wooden bars in place. Beyond them, Yasmina saw the magnificent black stallion munching a pile of dried grass. The building was a fort, dwelling place, and stable in one. You mean the one where he played Conan but wasn't actually Conan? Yeah. At the other end of the room, a girl in the vest and baggy trousers of a hillwoman squatted beside a small fire, cooking strips of meat on an iron grid laid over blocks of stone. There was a sooty cleft in the wall a few feet from the floor, and some of the smoke found its way out there. The rest floated in blue wisps about the room. The hill girl glanced at Yasmina over her shoulder, displaying a bold, handsome face, and then continued her cooking. Voices boomed outside. Then the door was kicked open, and Conan strode in. He looked more enormous than ever with the morning sunlight behind him, and Yasmina noted some details that had escaped her the night before. His garments were clean and not ragged. The broad Baccariate girdle that supported his knife in its ornamented scabbard would have matched the robes of a prince, and there was a glint of fine Turanian mail under his shirt. "Your captive is awake, Conan," said the Wazuli girl, and he grunted, strode up to the fire, and swept the strips of mutton off into a stone dish. The squatting girl laughed up at him with some spicy jest, and he grinned wolfishly and, hooking a toe under her haunches, tumbled her sprawling onto the floor. She seemed to derive considerable amusement from this bit of rough horseplay, but Conan paid no more heed to her. Producing a great hunk of bread from somewhere, with a copper jug of wine, he carried the lot to Yasmina, who had risen from her pallet and was regarding him doubtfully. "Rough fare for a Devi, girl, but our best," he grunted. "It will fill your belly at least." He set the platter on the floor, and she was suddenly aware of a ravenous hunger. Making no comment, she seated herself cross-legged on the floor, and taking the dish in her lap, she began to eat, using her fingers, which were all she had in the way of table utensils. After all, adaptability is one of the tests of true aristocracy. Conan stood looking down at her, his thumbs hooked in his girdle. He never sat cross-legged after the Eastern fashion. "Where am I?" she asked abruptly. "In the hut of Yar Afzal, the chief of the Kurum Wazulis," he answered. "Afghanistan lies a good many miles further on to the west. We'll hide here a while. The Kshatriyas are beating up the hills for you." How'd I do on that one? Several of their squads have been cut up by the tribes already. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Keep you under until Chunder Shan is willing to trade back my 7 cow thieves," he grunted. "Women of the Wazulis are crushing ink out of shoki leaves, and after a while you can write a letter to the governor." A touch of her old imperious wrath shook her, as she thought how maddeningly her plans had gone awry, leaving her captive of the very man she had plotted to get into her power. She flung down the dish with the remnants of her meal and sprang to her feet, tense with anger. "Oh, thank you. I will not write a letter. If you do not take me back, they will hang your 7 men, and 1,000 more besides." The Wazuli girl laughed mockingly. Conan scowled, and then the door opened, and Yar Afzal came swaggering in. The Wazuli chief was as tall as Conan, and of greater girth, but he looked fat and slow beside the hard compactness of the Cimmerian. He plucked his red-stained beard and stared meaningly at the Wazuli girl, and that wench rose and scurried out without delay. Then Yar Afzal turned to his guest. "The damnable people murmur, Conan," quoth he. "They wish me to murder you, and take the girl to hold for ransom. They say that anyone can tell by her garments that she is a noble lady. They say, why should the Avguli dogs profit by her, when it is the people who take the risk of guarding her?" "Lend me your horse," said Conan. "I'll take her and go." "Psh!" boomed Yar Afzal. "Do you think I can't handle my own people? I'll have them dancing in their shirts if they cross me. They don't love you, or any other outlander, but you saved my life once, and I will not forget. Come out, though, Conan. A scout has returned." Conan hitched at his girdle and followed the chief outside. They closed the door after them, and Yasmina peeped through a loophole. She looked out on a level space before the hut. At the farther end of that space there was a cluster of mud and stone huts, and she saw naked children playing among the boulders, and the slim, erect women of the hills going about their tasks. Directly before the chief's hut, a circle of hairy, ragged men squatted, facing the door. Conan and Yar Afzal stood a few paces before the door, and between them and the ring of warriors another man sat cross-legged. This one was addressing his chief in the harsh accents of the Wazuli, which Yasmina could scarcely understand, though as part of her royal education she had been taught the languages of Aranistan and the kindred tongues of Gulistan. "I talked with the Dagozai who saw the riders last night," said the scout. "He was lurking near when they came to the spot where we ambushed the Lord Conan. He overheard their speech. Chunder Shan was with them. They found the dead horse, and one of the men recognized it as Conan's. Then they found the man Conan slew, and knew him for a Wazuli. It seemed to them that Conan had been slain, and the girl taken by the Wazuli, so they turned aside from their purpose of following to Afghanistan. But they did not know from which village the dead man was come, and we had left no trail a Kshatriya could follow. So they rode to the nearest Wazuli village, which was the village of Jogra, and burnt it and slew many of the people. But the men of Kojur came upon them in darkness and slew some of them, and wounded the governor. So the survivors retired down the Zybar in the darkness before dawn, but they returned with reinforcements before sunrise, and there has been skirmishing and fighting in the hills all morning. It is said that a great army is being raised to sweep the hills about the Zybar. The tribes are whetting their knives and laying ambushes in every pass from here to the Guru Shah Valley. Moreover, Karim Shah has returned to the hills." A grunt went around the circle, and Yasmina leaned closer to the loophole at the name she had begun to mistrust. "Where went he?" demanded Yar Afzal. The Dagozai did not know. With him were 30 Irakzai of the lower villages. They rode into the hills and disappeared. "These Irakzai are jackals that follow a lion for crumbs," growled Yar Afzal. "They have been lapping up the coins Karim Shah scatters among the border tribes to buy men like horses. I like him not, for all he is our kinsman from the Iristan." "He's not even that," said Conan. "I know him of old. He is an Hyrcanian, a spy of Yezdajurd's. If I catch him, I'll hang his hide to a tamarisk." "But the Kshatriyas," clamored the men in the semicircle. "Are we to squat on our haunches until they smoke us out? They will learn at last in which Wazuli village the wench is held. We are not loved by the Zybari. They will help the Kshatriyas hunt us out." "Let them come," grunted Yar Afzal. "We can hold the defiles against a host." One of the men leaped up and shook his fist at Conan. "Are we to take all the risks while he reaps the rewards?" he howled. Are we to fight his battles for him? With a stride, Conan reached him and bent slightly to stare full into his hairy face. The Cimmerian had not drawn his long knife, but his left hand grasped the scabbard, jutting the hilt suggestively forward. I ask no man to fight my battles, he said softly. Draw your blade if you dare, you yapping dog. The Wazuli started back, snarling like a cat. Dare to touch me, and here are 50 men to rend you apart, he screeched. What? Roared Yarafzal, his face purpling with wrath. His whiskers bristled, his belly swelled with his rage. Are you chief of Kurum? Do the Wazulis take orders from Yarafzal, or from a low-breed cur? The man cringed before his invincible chief, and Yarafzal, striding up to him, seized him by the throat and choked him until his face was turning black. Then he hurled the man savagely against the ground and stood over him with his tulwar in hand. Is there any who questions my authority? He roared, and his warriors looked down sullenly as his bellicose glare swept their semicircle. Yarafzal grunted scornfully and sheathed his weapon with a gesture that was the apex of insult. Then he kicked the fallen agitator with a concentrated vindictiveness that brought howls from his victim. Get down the valley to the watchers on the heights, and bring word if they have seen anything, commanded Yarafzal. And the man went, shaking with fear and grinding his teeth with fury. Yarafzal then seated himself ponderously on a stone, growling in his beard. Conan stood near him, legs braced apart, thumbs hooked in his girdle, narrowly watching the assembled warriors. They stared at him sullenly, not daring to brave Yarafzal's fury, but hating the foreigner as only a hillman can hate. Now listen to me, you sons of nameless dogs, while I tell you what the Lord Conan and I have planned to fool the Kshatriyas. The boom of Yarafzal's bull-like voice followed the discomfited warrior as he slunk away from the assembly. The man passed by the cluster of huts, where women who had seen his defeat laughed at him and called him stinging comments, and hastened along the trail that wound among spurs and rocks toward the valley head. Just as he rounded the first turn that took him out of sight of the village, he stopped short, gaping stupidly. He had not believed it possible for a stranger to enter the valley of Kurum without being detected by the hawk-eyed watchers along the heights. Yet a man sat cross-legged on a low ledge beside the path, a man in a camel-hair robe and a green turban. The Wazuli's mouth gaped for a yell, and his hand leaped to his knife hilt. But that instant, his eyes met those of the stranger, and the cry died in his throat. His fingers went limp. He stood like a statue, his own eyes glazed and vacant. For minutes the scene held motionless. Then the man on the ledge drew a cryptic symbol in the dust on the rock with his forefinger. The Wazuli did not see him place anything within the compass of that emblem, but presently something gleamed there, a round, shiny black ball that looked like polished jade. The man in the green turban took this up and tossed it to the Wazuli, who mechanically caught it. Carry this to Yarafzal, he said, and the Wazuli turned like an automaton and went back along the path, holding the black jade ball in his outstretched hand. He did not even turn his head to the renewed jeers of the women as he passed the huts. He did not seem to hear. The man on the ledge gazed after him with a cryptic smile. A girl's head rose above the rim of the ledge, and she looked at him with admiration and a touch of fear that had not been present the night before. Why did you do that? She asked. He ran his fingers through her dark locks caressingly. Are you still dizzy from your flight on the horse of air that you doubt my wisdom? He laughed. As long as Yarafzal lives, Conan will bide safe among the Wazuli fighting men. Their knives are sharp, and there are many of them. What I plot will be safer, even for me, than to seek to slay him and take her from among them. It takes no wizard to predict what the Wazulis will do, and what Conan will do, when my victim hands the globe of Yazud to the chief of Kurum. Back before the hut, Yarafzal halted in the midst of some tirade, surprised and displeased to see the man he had sent up the valley, pushing his way through the throng. I bade you to go to the watchers, the chief bellowed. You have not had time to come from them. The other did not reply. He stood woodenly, staring vacantly into the chief's face, his palm outstretched, holding the jade ball. Conan, looking over Yarafzal's shoulder, murmured something and reached to touch the chief's arm, but as he did so, Yarafzal, in a paroxysm of anger, struck the man with his clenched fist and felled him like an ox. As he fell, the jade sphere rolled to Yarafzal's foot, and the chief, seeming to see it for the first time, bent and picked it up. The men, staring perplexedly at their senseless comrade, saw their chief bend, but they did not see what he picked up from the ground. Yarafzal straightened, glanced at the jade, and made a motion to thrust it into his girdle. "Carry that fool to his hut," he growled. "He has the look of a lotus-eater. He returned me a blank stare. Aye! In his right hand, moving toward his girdle, he had suddenly felt movement where movement should not be. His voice died away as he stood and glared at nothing, and inside his clenched right hand he felt the quivering of change, of motion, of life. He no longer held a smooth, shining sphere in his fingers, and he dared not look. His tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not open his hand. His astonished warriors saw Yarafzal's eyes distend, the color ebb from his face. Then suddenly, a bellow of agony burst from his bearded lips. He swayed and fell as if struck by lightning, his right arm tossed out in front of him. Face down he lay, and from between his opening fingers crawled a spider, a hideous, black, hairy-legged monster whose body shone like black jade. The men yelled and gave back suddenly, and the creature scuttled into a crevice of the rocks and disappeared. The warriors started up, glaring wildly, and a voice rose above their clamor, a far-carrying voice of command which came from none knew where. Afterward, each man there, who still lived, denied that he had shouted, but all there heard it. "Yarafzal is dead! Kill the outlander!" That shout focused their whirling minds as one. Doubt, bewilderment, and fear vanished in the uproaring surge of the bloodlust. A furious yell rent the skies as the tribesmen responded instantly to the suggestion. They came headlong across the open space, cloaks flapping, eyes blazing, and knives lifted. Conan's action was as quick as theirs. As the voice shouted, he sprang for the hut door, but they were closer to him than he was to the door, and with one foot on the sill, he had to wheel and parry the swipe of a yard-long blade. He split the man's skull, ducked another swinging knife, and gutted the wielder, felled a man with his left fist and stabbed another in the belly, and heaved back mightily against the closed door with his shoulders. Hacking blades were nicking chips out of the jambs about his ears, but the door flew open under the impact of his shoulders, and he went stumbling backward into the room. A bearded tribesman, thrusting with all his fury as Conan sprang back, overreached and pitched headfirst through the doorway. Conan stopped, grasped the slack of his garments and hauled him clear, and slammed the door in the faces of the men who came surging into it. Bones snapping under the impact, and the next instant Conan slammed the bolts into place and whirled with desperate haste to meet the man who sprang from the floor and tore into action like a madman. Yasmina cowered in a corner, staring in horror as the two men fought back and forth across the room, almost trampling her at times. The flash and clangor of their blades filled the room, and outside the mob clamored like a wolf pack, hacking deafeningly at the bronze door with their long knives and dashing huge rocks against it. Somebody fetched a tree trunk, and the door began to stagger under the thunderous assault. Yasmina clasped her ears, staring wildly. Violence and fury within, cataclysmic madness without. The stallion in a stall neighed and reared, thundering with his heels against the walls. He wheeled and launched his hooves through the bars just as the tribesmen, backing away from Conan's murderous swipes, stumbled against them. His spine cracked in 3 places like a rotten branch, and he was hurled headlong against the Cimmerian, bearing him backwards so that they both crashed to the beaten floor. Yasmina cried out and ran forward. To her dazed sight, it seemed that both were slain. She reached them just as Conan threw aside the corpse and rose. She caught his arm, trembling from head to foot. "Oh, you live! I thought you were dead." He glanced down at her quickly, into the pale, upturned face and the wide, staring eyes. "Why are you trembling?" he demanded. "Why should you care if I live or die?" A vestige of her poise returned to her, and she drew away, making a rather pitiful attempt at playing the Devi. "You are preferable to those wolves howling without," she answered, gesturing toward the door, the stone sill of which was beginning to splinter away. "That won't hold long," he muttered, then turned and went swiftly to the stall of the stallion. Yasmina clenched her hands and caught her breath as she saw him tear aside the splintered bars and go into the stall with the maddened beast. The stallion reared above him, neighing terribly, hooves lifted, eyes and teeth flashing and ears laid back. But Conan leaped and caught his mane with a display of sheer strength that seemed impossible, and dragged the beast down on his forelegs. The steed snorted and quivered, but stood still while the man bridled him and clapped on the gold-worked saddle with the wide silver stirrups. Wheeling the beast around in the stall, Conan called quickly to Yasmina, and the girl came, sidling nervously past the stallion's heels. Conan was working at the stone wall, talking swiftly as he worked. A secret door in the wall here that not even the Wazuli know about. Yar Zal showed it to me once when he was drunk. It opens out onto the mouth of the ravine behind the hut. Ha! As he tugged at a projection that seemed casual, a whole section of the wall slid back on oiled iron runners. Looking through, the girl saw a narrow defile opening in a sheer stone cliff within a few feet of the hut's back wall. Then Conan sprang into the saddle and hauled her up before him. Behind them, the great door groaned like a living thing and crashed in, and a yell rang to the roof as the entrance was instantly flooded with hairy faces and knives and hairy fists. And then the great stallion went through the wall like a javelin from a catapult and thundered into the defile, running low, foam flying from the bit rings. That move came as an absolute surprise to the Wazulis. It was a surprise, too, to those stealing down the ravine. It happened so quickly, the hurricane-like charge of the great horse, that a man in a green turban was unable to get out of the way. He went down under the frantic hooves, and a girl screamed. Conan got one glimpse of her as they thundered by, a slim, dark girl in silk trousers and a jeweled breastband, flattening herself against the ravine wall. Then the black horse and his riders were gone up the gorge like the spume blown before a storm, and the men who came tumbling through the wall into the defile after them met that which changed their yells of bloodlust to shrill screams of fear and death. Chapter 6. The Mountain of the Black Sears. Where now? Yasmina was trying to sit erect on the rocking saddlebow, clutching her captor. She was conscious of a recognition of shame that she should not find unpleasant the feel of his muscular flesh under her fingers. "To Afghanistan," he answered. "It's a perilous road, but the stallion will carry us easily, unless we fall in with some of your friends, or my tribal enemies. Now that Yar Zal is dead, those damned Wazulis will be on our heels. I'm surprised we haven't sighted them behind us already." "Who's that man you rode down?" she asked. "I don't know. I never saw him before. He's no ghoulie, that's certain. What the devil he was doing there is more than I can say. There was a girl with him, too." "Yes." Her gaze was shadowed. "I cannot understand that. That girl was my maid, Gitara. Do you suppose she was coming to aid me? That the man was a friend? If so, the Wazulis have captured them both." "Well," he answered, "there's nothing we can do. If we go back, they'll skin us both. I can't understand how a girl like that could get this far into the mountains with only one man, and he a robed scholar, for that's what he looked like. There's something infernally queer in all this. That fellow Yar Zal beat and sent away. He moved like a man walking in his sleep. I've seen the priests of Zamora perform their abominable rituals in their forbidden temples, and their victims had a stare like that man. The priests looked into their eyes and muttered incantations, and then the people became the walking dead men, with glassy eyes, doing as they were ordered. And then I saw what the fellow had in his hand, which Yar Zal picked up. It was like a big black jade bead, such as the temple girls of Yazud wear when they dance before the black stone spider which is their god. Yar Zal held it in his hand, and he didn't pick up anything else. Yet when he fell dead, a spider, like the god at Yazud, only smaller, ran out of his fingers. And then, when the Wazuli stood uncertain there, a voice cried out for them to kill me, and I know that voice didn't come from any of the warriors, nor from the women who watched by the huts. It seemed to come from above. Yasmina did not reply. She glanced at the stark outlines of the mountains all about them and shuddered. Her soul shrank from their gaunt brutality. This was a grim, naked land where anything might happen. Age-old traditions invested it with shuddery horror for anyone born in the hot, luxuriant southern plains. The sun was high, beating down with fierce heat, yet the wind that blew in fitful gusts seemed to sweep off slopes of ice. Once she heard a strange rushing above them that was not the sweep of the wind, and from the way Conan looked up, she knew it was not a common sound to him either. She thought that a strip of the cold blue sky was momentarily blurred, as if some all but invisible object had swept between it and herself, but she could not be sure. Neither made any comment, but Conan loosened his knife in his scabbard. They were following a faintly marked path dipping down into ravines so deep the sun never struck bottom, laboring up steep slopes where loose shale threatened to slide from beneath their feet, and following knife-edge ridges with blue-hazed echoing depths on either hand. The sun had passed its zenith when they crossed a narrow trail winding among the crags. Conan reined the horse aside and followed it southward, going almost at right angles to their former course. A Galzai village is at one end of this trail, he explained. Their women follow it to a well for water, and you need new garments. Glancing down at her filmy attire, Yasmina agreed with him. Her cloth of gold slippers were in tatters, her robes and silken undergarments torn to shreds that scarcely held together decently. Garments meant for the streets of Peshkari were scarcely appropriate for the crags of the Himalayas. Coming to a crook in the trail, Conan dismounted, helped Yasmina down, and waited. Presently he nodded, though she heard nothing. A woman coming along the trail, he remarked. In sudden panic, she clutched his arm. You will not kill her. I don't kill women ordinarily, he grunted, though some of the hill women are she-wolves. No, he grinned as at a huge jest. By Crom, I'll pay for her clothes. How is that? He displayed a large handful of gold coins and replaced all but the largest. She nodded, much relieved. It was perhaps natural for men to slay and die. Her flesh crawled at the thought of watching the butchery of a woman. Presently, a woman appeared around the crook of the trail, a tall, slim Galzai girl, straight as a young sapling, bearing a great empty gourd. She stopped short, and the gourd fell from her hands when she saw them. She wavered as though to run, then realized that Conan was too close to allow her to escape, and so stood still, staring at them with a mixed expression of fear and curiosity. Conan displayed the gold coin. If you will give this woman your garments, he said, I will give you this money. The response was instant. The girl smiled broadly with surprise and delight, and with the disdain of a hill woman for prudish conventions, promptly yanked off her sleeveless embroidered vest, slipped down her wide trousers, and stepped out of them, twitched off her wide-sleeved shirt, and kicked off her sandals. Bundling them all in a bunch, she proffered them to Conan, who handed them to the astonished Devi. Get behind that rock and put these on, he directed, further proving himself no native hillman. Fold your robes up into a bundle and bring them to me when you come out. The money, clamored the hill girl, stretching out her hands eagerly. The gold you promised me. Conan flipped the coin to her. She caught it, bit, then thrust it into her hair, bent and caught up the gourd and went on down the path, as devoid of self-consciousness as of garments. Conan waited with some impatience while the Devi, for the first time in her pampered life, dressed herself. When she stepped from behind the rock, he swore in surprise, and she felt a curious rush of emotions at the unrestrained admiration burning in his fierce blue eyes. She felt shame, embarrassment, yet a stimulation of vanity she had never before experienced, and a tingling when meeting the impact of his eyes. He laid a heavy hand on her shoulder and turned her about, staring avidly at her from all angles. By Crom, said he, In those smoky mystic robes you were aloof and cold as a far-off star. Now you were a woman of warm flesh and blood. You went behind that rock as the Devi of Vindhya. You come out as a hill girl, though 1,000 times more beautiful than any wench of the Zybar. You were a goddess. Now you are real. He spanked her resoundingly, and she, recognizing this as merely another expression of admiration, did not feel outraged. It was indeed as if the changing of her garments had wrought a change in her personality. The feelings and sensations she had suppressed rose to domination in her now, as if the queenly robes she had cast off had been material shackles and inhibitions. But Conan, in his renewed admiration, did not forget that peril lurked all about them. The farther they drew away from the region of the Zybar, the less likely he was to encounter any Kshatriya troops. On the other hand, he had been listening all throughout their flight for sounds that would tell him the vengeful Wazulis of Kurum were on their heels. Swinging the Devi up, he followed her into the saddle, and again reined the stallion westward. The bundle of garments she had given him he hurled over a cliff, to fall into the depths of a 1,000-foot gorge. "Why did you do that?" she asked. "Why did you not give them to the girl?" "The riders from Peshkuri are combing these hills," he said. "They'll be ambushed and harried at every turn, and by way of reprisal they'll destroy every village they can take. They may turn westward at any time. If they found a girl wearing your garments, they'd torture her into talking, and she might put them on my trail." "What will she do?" asked Yasmina. "Go back to her village and tell her people that a stranger attacked her," he answered. "She'll have them on our track all right, but she had to go on and get the water first. If she dared go back without it, they'd whip the skin off of her. That gives us a long start. They'll never catch us. By nightfall, we'll cross the Afghuli border." "There are no paths or signs of human habitation in these parts," she commented. "Even for the Himalayans, this region seems singularly deserted. We've not seen a trail since we left the one where we met the Galzai woman." For answer, he pointed to the northwest, where she glimpsed a peak and a notch of the crags. "Yimsha," grunted Conan. "The tribes build their villages as far from the mountain as they can." She was instantly rigid with attention. "Yimsha," she whispered. "The mountain of the black Sears." "So they say," he answered. "This is as near as I ever approached it. I have swung north to avoid any Kshatriya troop that might be prowling through the hills. The regular trail from Kurum to Afghanistan lies further south. This is an ancient one, and seldom used." She was staring intently at the distant peak. Her nails bit into her pink palms. How long would it take to reach Yimsha from this point? "All the rest of the day, and all night," he answered, and grinned. "Do you want to go there? By Crom, it's no place for an ordinary human, from what the hill people say." "Why do they not gather and destroy the devils that inhabit it?" she demanded. "Wipe out wizards with swords? Anyway, they never interfere with people, unless the people interfere with them. I never saw one of them, though I've talked with men who swore they had. They say they've glimpsed people from the tower among the crags at sunset or sunrise. Tall, silent men in black robes." "Would you be afraid to attack them?" "I?" The idea seemed a new one to him. "Why, if they imposed upon me, it would be my life or theirs. But I have nothing to do with them. I came to these mountains to raise a following of human beings, not to war with wizards." Yasmina did not at once reply. She stared at the peak as at a human enemy, feeling all her anger and hatred stir in her bosom anew. And another feeling began to take dim shape. She had plotted to hurl against the masters of Yimsha the man in whose arms she was now carried. Perhaps there was another way besides the method she had planned to accomplish her purpose. She could not mistake the look that was beginning to dawn in this wild man's eyes as they rested on her. Kingdoms have fallen when a woman's slim white hands pulled the strings of destiny. I've never heard them called strings of destiny before. Suddenly she stiffened, pointing. "Look!" Just visible on the distant peak, there hung a cloud of peculiar aspect. It was a frosty crimson in color, veined with sparkling gold. This cloud was in motion. It rotated, and as it whirled, it contracted. It dwindled to a spinning taper that flashed in the sun. And suddenly it detached itself from the snow-tipped peak, floated out over the void like a gay-hued feather, and became invisible against the cerulean sky. "What could that have been?" asked the girl uneasily, as a shoulder of rock shut the distant mountain from view. The phenomenon had been disturbing, even in its beauty. "The hillmen call it Yimsha's carpet, whatever that means," answered Conan. "I've seen 500 of them running as if the devil were at their heels to hide themselves in caves and crags because they saw that crimson cloud float up from the peak. What in—" They advanced through a narrow knife-cut gash between turreted walls and emerged upon a broad ledge, flanked by a series of rugged slopes on one hand and a gigantic precipice on the other. The dim trail followed this ledge, bent around a shoulder, and reappeared at intervals far below, working a tedious way downward. And emerging from the cut that opened upon the ledge, the black stallion halted short, snorting. Conan urged him on impatiently, and the horse snorted and threw his head up and down, quivering and straining as if against an invisible barrier. Yet Conan swore and swung off, lifting Yasmina down with him. He went forward with a hand thrown out before him, as if expecting to encounter unseen resistance. But there was nothing to hinder him, though when he tried to lead the horse, it neighed shrilly and jerked back. Then Yasmina cried out, and Conan whirled, hand starting to knife hilt. Neither of them had seen him come, but he stood there, with his arms folded, a man in a camel-hair robe and a green turban. Conan grunted with surprise to recognize the man the stallion had spurned in the ravine outside the Wazuli village. "Who the devil are you?" he demanded. The man did not answer. Conan noticed that his eyes were wide, fixed, and of a peculiar luminous quality, and those eyes held his like a magnet. Kimsa's sorcery was based on hypnotism, as is the case with most Eastern magic. The way has been prepared for the hypnotist for untold centuries of generations who have lived and died in the firm conviction of the reality and power of hypnotism, building up by mass thought and practice a colossal though intangible atmosphere against which the individual, steeped in the traditions of the land, finds himself helpless. But Conan was not a son of the East. Its traditions were meaningless to him. He was the product of an utterly alien atmosphere. Hypnotism was not even a myth in Samaria. The heritage that prepared a native of the East for submission to the mesmerist was not his. He was aware of what Kimsa was trying to do to him, but he felt the impact of the man's uncanny power only as a vague impulsion, a tugging and pulling that he could shake off as a man shakes spiderwebs from his garments. Aware of hostility and black magic, he ripped out his long knife and lunged, as quick on his feet as a mountain lion. But hypnotism was not all of Kimsa's magic. Yasmina, watching, did not see by what roguery of movement or illusion the man in the green turban avoided the terrible disemboweling thrust. But the keen blade wickered between side and lifted arm, and to Yasmina it seemed that Kimsa merely brushed his open palm lightly against Conan's bull neck. But the Cimmerian went down like a slain ox. Yet Conan was not dead. Breaking his fall with his left hand, he slashed at Kimsa's legs even as he went down, and the Rakshasa avoided the scythe-like swipe only by a most unwizardly bound backward. Then Yasmina cried out sharply as she saw a woman she recognized as Gitara glide out from among the rocks and come up to the man. The greeting died in the Devi's throat as she saw the malevolence in the girl's beautiful face. Conan was rising slowly, shaken and dazed by the cruel craft of that blow, which, delivered with an art forgotten of Ben before Atlantis sank, would have broken like a rotten twig the neck of a lesser man. Kimsa gazed at him cautiously, and a trifle uncertainly. The Rakshas learned the full flood of his own power when he faced at bay the knives of the maddened Wazulis in the ravine behind Kurum village. But the Cimmerian's resistance had perhaps shaken his newfound confidence a trifle. Sorcery thrives on success, not on failure. He stepped forward, lifting his hand, then halted as if frozen, head tilted back, eyes wide open, hand raised. In spite of himself, Conan followed his gaze, and so did the woman, the girl cowering by the trembling stallion and the girl beside Kimsa. Down the mountain slopes, like a whirl of shining dust blown before the wind, a crimson conoid cloud came dancing. Kimsa's dark face turned ashen. His hand began to tremble, then sank to his side. The girl beside him, sensing the change in him, stared at him inquiringly. The crimson shape left the mountain slope and came down at a long, arching sweep. It struck the ledge between Conan and Kimsa, and the Raksha gave back with a stifled cry. He backed away, pushing the girl Gitara back with groping, fending hands. The crimson cloud balanced like a spinning top for an instant, whirling in dazzling sheen on its point. Then without warning it was gone, vanished as a bubble vanishes when burst. There, on the ledge, stood 4 men. It was miraculous, incredible, impossible, yet it was true. They were not ghosts or phantoms. They were 4 tall men, with shaven, vulture-like heads, and black robes that hid their feet. Their hands were concealed by their wide sleeves. They stood in silence, their naked heads nodding slightly in unison. They were facing Kimsa, but behind them, Conan felt his own blood turning to ice in his veins. Rising, he backed stealthily away until he could feel the stallion's shoulder trembling against his back, and the Devi crept into the shelter of his arm. There was no word spoken. Silence hung like a stifling pall. All 4 of the men in black robes stared at Kimsa. Their vulture-like faces were immobile, their eyes introspective and contemplative. But Kimsa shook like a man in ague. His feet were braced on the rock, his calves straining as if in physical combat. Sweat ran in streams down his dark face. His right hand locked on something under his brown robe, so desperately that the blood ebbed from that hand and left it white. His left hand fell on the shoulder of Gitara and clutched in agony like the grasp of a drowning man. She did not flinch or whimper, though his fingers dug like talons into her firm flesh. Conan had witnessed hundreds of battles in his wild life, but never one like this, wherein 4 diabolical wills sought to beat down one lesser but equally devilish will that opposed them. But he only faintly sensed the monstrous quality of that hideous struggle. With his back to the wall, driven to bay by his former masters, Kimsa was fighting for his life with all the dark power, all the frightful knowledge they had taught him through the long, grim years of neophytism and vassalage. He was stronger than even he had guessed, and the free exercise of his powers in his own behalf had tapped unsuspected reservoirs of forces, and he was nerved to super-energy by frantic fear and desperation. He reeled before the merciless impact of those hypnotic eyes, but he held his ground. His features were distorted into a bestial grin of agony, and his limbs were twisted as on a rack. It was a war of souls, of frightful brains steeped in lore forbidden to men for 1,000,000 years, of mentalities which had plumbed the abysses and explored the dark spawns where spawn the shadows. Yasmina understood this better than did Conan, and she dimly understood why Kimsa could withstand the concentrated impact of those 4 hellish wills, which might have blasted into atoms the very rock on which he stood. The reason was the girl that he clutched with the strength of his despair. She was like an anchor to his staggering soul, battered by the waves of those psychic emanations. His weakness was now his strength. His love for the girl, violent and evil though it might be, was yet a tie that bound him to the rest of humanity, providing an earthly leverage for his will, a chain that his inhuman enemies could not break, at least not break through Kimsa. They realized that before he did, and one of them turned his gaze from the Raksha full upon Gitara. There was no battle there. The girl shrank and wilted like a leaf in the drought. Irresistibly impelled, she tore herself from her lover's arms before he realized what was happening. Then a hideous thing came to pass. She began to back toward the precipice, facing her tormentors, her eyes wide and blank as dark gleaming glass from behind which a lamp has been blown out. Kimsa groaned and staggered toward her, falling into the trap set for him. A divided mind could not maintain the unequal battle. He was beaten, a straw in their hands. The girl went backward, walking like an automaton, and Kimsa reeled drunkenly after her, hands vainly outstretched, groaning and slobbering in pain, his feet moving heavily like dead things. On the very brink she paused, standing stiffly, her heels on the edge, and he fell on his knees and crawled whimpering toward her, groping for her, drag her back from destruction. And just before his clumsy fingers touched her, one of the wizards laughed, like the sudden bronze note of a bell in hell. The girl reeled suddenly, and consummate climax of exquisite cruelty, reason and understanding flooded back into her eyes, which flared with an awful fear. She screamed, clutching wildly at her lover's straining hand, and then, unable to save herself, fell headlong with a moaning cry. Kimsa hauled himself to the edge and stared over, haggardly, his lips working as he mumbled to himself. Then he turned and stared for a long minute at his torturers, with wide eyes that held no human light. And then with a cry that almost burst the rocks, he reeled up and came rushing toward them, a knife lifted in his hand. One of the Rakshas stepped forward and stamped his foot, and as he stamped, there came a rumbling that grew swiftly to a grinding roar. Where his foot struck, a crevice opened in the solid rock that widened instantly. Then, with a deafening crash, a whole section of the ledge gave way. There was a last glimpse of Kimsa, with arms wildly upflung, and then he vanished amidst the roar of the avalanche that thundered down into the abyss. The four looked contemplatively at the ragged edge of rock that formed the new rim of the precipice, and then turned suddenly. Conan, thrown off his feet by the shudder of the mountain, was rising, lifting Yasmina. He seemed to move slowly as his brain was working. He was befogged and stupid. He realized that there was a desperate need for him to lift the Devi on the black stallion and ride like the wind, but an unaccountable sluggishness weighted his every thought and action. And now the wizards had turned toward him. They raised their arms, and to his horrified sight, he saw their outlines fading, dimming, becoming hazy and nebulous as a crimson smoke billowed around their feet and rose about them. They were blotted out by a sudden whirling cloud, and then he realized that he too was enveloped in a blinding crimson mist. He heard Yasmina scream, and the stallion cried out like a woman in pain. The Devi was torn from his arm, and as he lashed out with his knife blindly, a terrific blow like a gust of storm wind knocked him sprawling against a rock. Dazedly, he saw a crimson conoid cloud spinning up and over the mountain slopes. Yasmina was gone, and so were the four men in black. Only the terrified stallion shared the ledge with him. All right. And we will pick it back up with Chapter 7 next week. Oh, hey, Storytime Allie. Glad to have you here. Allie is one of the other streamers that actually reads stories along with me. So if you guys are enjoying my stream, please head over and give her stuff a look to and a listen. She's pretty good. She reads a lot more modern stuff than what I do. My stuff is mostly of the 100-year-old variety. I think she's reading Darkly Dreaming Dexter and the Harvard Psychedelic Club right now, if I remember right. But give her a check out, too, if you were enjoying the stream here. And while you're here, please don't forget to scroll down and hit that follow button. It really is an awesome show of support and helps me keep doing what I'm doing here. And I appreciate your patience as I'm learning and going along with this. Thank you, Meg. Everybody already knows you're the one teaching me how to do this stuff. But I am very grateful for it, so thank you. I hope all of you can catch tomorrow's stream. We're going to be continuing on with The Mysterious Affair at Styles by Agatha Christie. And if I can get that poll working that tried to poke its head in earlier in the stream, we'll be voting on who you think the killer is. So we'll get a little bit of interaction, find out if you're right or not. that stream right there that just poked, or that pulp right there that just poked its head in again. Because I didn't turn it off before this stream. Yeah. It'll also have more choices. I'm not just making you pick between John and Alfred. All right. Well, have a great day. I really appreciate everybody coming to join me, and hopefully I will see all of you for the stream tomorrow. Have a good day. Thank you for joining.